It began with a thunderclap of accusation. Jasmine Crockett, charged with judicial interference and slapped with a 5-year suspension. But when she came face-to-face with Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, a single question and a folder, worth $2.7 million, flipped the script. Within 24 hours, his authority evaporated, and the system that once silenced her staggered into full paralysis. What did Jasmine say that broke a Supreme Court justice? Stay with us. This story is not just news, it's revelation. The wind howled through Washington that morning like a warning. At 6:13 a.m., Jasmine's phone buzzed, a text that felt more like a threat than a summons. Report to the D.C. Federal Court of Appeals by 9 a.m. No explanation, no counsel informed, just a cold legal bullet with no fingerprints. The charge? A vague and hollow claim, abuse of influence, tampering with federal proceedings. But 3 days earlier, she'd ripped into the judiciary during a Senate hearing. Unapologetic, unfiltered, and unforgettable. No names needed. Her words landed like detonations. And now, the machine she criticized had come for her. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere congealed with tension. Reporters, Hill staffers, and a sea of federal observers watched as the chamber doors opened and the unexpected storm walked in. Brett Kavanaugh. Not a visitor. Not a ceremonial presence. He sat as presiding judge, an act without precedent, logic, or constitutional legitimacy. He wasn't supposed to be there, and that was the point. He had come not to judge fairly, but to punish. As Jasmine's counsel rose to speak, Kavanaugh sliced him down mid-breath. "We don't need rehearsed defenses," he snapped. Not a ruling, a silencing. Then his attention turned to Jasmine. "You," he said, like a diagnosis. A dangerous cocktail. Ambition, low ethics, unearned confidence. Each word hit like a backhand. It wasn't law. It was disdain cloaked in judicial robes. Jasmine sat still, unfazed. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And then came the blow. No deliberation, no citations, no rationale, just the dry hammer of power misused. "You are suspended from all government duties for 5 years, he declared. "Effective immediately." Outside, the headlines erupted. Crockett silenced, courtroom showdown, Kavanaugh strikes back. But inside, Jasmine stayed frozen, not with fear, but fury. Because she'd seen this before, not in marble courtrooms, but on Houston streets, under fluorescent lights and white officer flashlights. At 17, a police officer pinned her to the sidewalk for walking home. She remembered the cracks in the pavement more vividly than the blood on her cheek. It wasn't the first time someone tried to remind her she didn't belong, but it was the first time she understood why. Through law school, courtrooms, and civil rights battles, she carried that fire. She wasn't driven by ambition, but by memory. She defended the defenseless, won cases others deemed lost causes, and made enemies of institutions that never thought she'd stand this tall. But this courtroom wasn't a case. It was a crucifixion. And yet, just as the door closed behind her, the system made its gravest error. It underestimated her silence. As Jasmine exited into the courthouse corridor, a shadow stepped forward. Senator Allen Rivers. He didn't speak. He just handed her a brown leather envelope and vanished. Inside, evidence. DOJ-stamped files, wire transfers, luxury gifts, $2.7 million to settle a misconduct allegation. The recipient, a Delaware-based nonprofit. The purpose, sealing a 2016 sexual misconduct case, the name redacted, the implication unmistakable. The corruption she faced wasn't personal, it was systemic. And suddenly she held the receipts. When she re-entered that courtroom, the room braced for a repeat. They didn't expect a reversal. "Your Honor," she began, poised, steel behind her calm, I request to enter a statement for the record. Kavanaugh hesitated. He felt the walls tilt. Make it brief, he said, but his voice cracked around the edges. Jasmine reached into her briefcase. Out came the leather envelope. She unfolded the DOJ-sealed memo, lifted it for all to see. Every camera clicked, every breath stalled. This is an internal DOJ memo, she said. It documents undisclosed luxury gifts, financial entanglements, and sealed settlements tied to Justice Brett Kavanaugh. She read, line by line, private jets, resorts, consulting fees, shell companies, meetings with lobbyists. Then the bombshell. A $2.7 million wire transfer linked to a 2016 misconduct claim during his nomination process. The courtroom didn't flinch. It froze. Then came the audio recording, a young woman's trembling voice. He told me if I went public, they'd destroy me. It wouldn't be the judge. It'd be those who protect him. The room didn't breathe. When the voice faded, the consequences did not. And then, history shifted. A senior DOJ official seated quietly in the gallery rose. No words, no gestures. Just walked out, like someone abandoning a sinking ship. Outside the courthouse, the DOJ made it official. Brett Kavanaugh's special supervisory role suspended, effective immediately. Inside, the court clerk read a reversal. The 5-year suspension of Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated. The process was in violation of constitutional fairness. The court apologizes. Kavanaugh didn't stand. He didn't argue. He just sat, hands flat, gaze lost. The robe on his shoulders looked less like power, more like burden. He finally rose, not with defiance, but resignation, and walked out alone through a door he once ruled behind. No applause, no noise, just consequence. Jasmine remained still, not vindictive, just resolute. When she finally spoke, her words carved deeper than any verdict. I don't need him to lose his position, she said. I need a system where he could never have used it to shield misconduct in the first place. And with that, the room changed. Not with cheers, but with understanding. It wasn't about him walking out. It was about what came next. Jasmine didn't claim victory. She claimed truth. And in that courtroom, once ruled by gavels and shadows, a new silence began. The kind that comes before rebuilding. And she stood, not as a survivor, but as the architect of what must come next. A woman doubted, dismissed, nearly erased, was now redrawing the boundaries of justice. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that courtroom to perform. She walked in to alter the course. 3 sheets of paper laid flat on the podium, quiet but heavy with consequence. No legal jargon, no pageantry, just bold text in clean type. The first, a fully independent Judicial Ethics Commission, untethered from the executive branch. No explanation needed. The chamber knew what it meant. Oversight that answered to principle, not power. The end of self-policing, the beginning of accountability. For too long, judges investigated themselves, and we paid the price. Brick by brick, Jasmine was calling for the dismantling of that wall. The second sheet, a requirement to disclose all gifts, favors, and financial relationships over $100, updated quarterly and publicly audited. That was when the discomfort set in. Jasmine noticed. She didn't care, because this clause wasn't symbolic. It was surgical, a direct hit to the quiet corruption veiled in hospitality, the donors, the favors, the vacation homes masquerading as generosity. Justice, she said, cannot be bought in cigars, scotch, or yacht invitations. A camera line, sure, but also a line history would remember. The third sheet, held high, etched itself into silence. Absolute whistleblower protection for judicial clerks, researchers, staff, and personnel. A murmur rippled through the judiciary bench. Jasmine looked straight ahead. No woman should be threatened into silence by the institution claiming to uphold the law. This was not performance. This was a reckoning. Her final words hung in the chamber like steel. Without protection for truth-tellers, the truth never gets told. There was no applause, just the sound of something deeper, movement, aides taking notes, members of Congress leaning into their staff, phones capturing the documents, no objections, no clarifying questions. For the first time in decades, the chamber wasn't rehearsing ritual. It was witnessing awakening. What Jasmine laid down was not a wish list. It was a blueprint. And the only question now was who would have the spine to follow it. She didn't wait for permission. She turned from the podium and locked eyes not with her peers, but with an intern in the back row. Silent, subtle, unmistakable. The nod that said, "This is for you." Outside, the media was already breaking. Headlines rewritten in real time. Within minutes, our Crockett reforms was everywhere. But inside, silence still ruled. A sacred kind. The kind that follows truth. One staffer whispered, "It's begun." Another replied, "No, she began it." Within 24 hours, Jasmine's confrontation with Justice Kavanaugh had over 70 million views. The video, raw and uninterrupted, cut through every feed. It wasn't just viral, it was visceral. Her line, "Do you believe accepting yachts and cash from litigants is somehow more ethical?" embedded itself in the nation's bloodstream. Commentators didn't analyze it. They surrendered to it. Students posted, "This is why I applied to law school." Veterans reposted, "This is what I fought for." Civil rights leaders called it the most powerful courtroom moment since Anita Hill. Ideologues from both sides stopped debating and started listening, not to her politics, but to her proof. By 10:42 the next morning, the House Speaker formed a special oversight committee to review every Supreme Court justice confirmed in the last 20 years. It passed with bipartisan support within hours. Hearings. Subpoenas. Old ethics complaints resurfaced. In universities across the country, professors rewrote syllabi overnight. Jasmine's testimony streamed in law, ethics, and political science courses. "This is what institutional courage looks like," said a Harvard scholar. Whistleblower networks lit up with encrypted calls. Clerks, staffers, even junior attorneys, finally speaking. And while chaos churned, Jasmine disappeared from the spotlight. Not for rest, for resolve. No press tour, no selfies, just a single statement. Jasmine Crockett's work speaks for itself. Now so must the system. A week. Later, she reemerged, not to speak but to file. The Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act of 2025, financial disclosures, quarterly audits, lifetime bans on ruling in cases involving benefactors, whistleblower protection carved into law, and then something no one predicted, lawmakers rushing to co-sponsor. Democrats, Republicans, names that never shared space on bills. By sunset, 40. By midnight, 92. Not from pressure, but clarity. Jasmine hadn't demanded loyalty. She made silence impossible. The effect was tectonic. The Judiciary Committee called an emergency briefing. Analysts worked through the night. Budget. Teams scouted cost projections. No one slowed it down. Everyone raced to keep up. Across America, people showed up. Handwritten signs, courthouse steps, projected quotes on federal buildings. Justice isn't performance, it's an audit, Jasmine. Hadn't given them scandal. She gave them standard, and still she stayed silent. Until one morning at 6 a.m., an essay appeared in The Atlantic with a headline as unflinching as her gaze. Justice does not come from a black robe. It comes from light aimed at the place power fears most, the truth. No names, no drama, just reality stripped of polish. She wrote of silence as complicity, tradition as cover, reverence as rot. She asked America not to trust power, but to question it. Within hours, the essay had been reprinted worldwide. Law professors dubbed it the Gettysburg of Judicial Reform. But Jasmine didn't reply. She legislated. She returned to Texas, quietly. Streets once hostile, now lined with people holding signs that said, "Let her speak," and "No more silent benches." At her old high school, she stood before students who once watched her on TikTok and now saw her in person. No spectacle. Just a story. A student asked, "Weren't you scared?" She smiled. "I wasn't standing in front of him. I was standing behind everyone who never had the microphone to answer back." That line didn't land. It settled. It didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to them. Days later, a photo surfaced from Columbia Law's reading room, the same school that once rejected her, etched into the wall her quote, and beneath it, Jasmine Crockett, Congressional Hearing 2025. Law students stood beside it. Professors taught from it. Civil rights groups adopted it. And Jasmine? She received a handwritten letter, no return address. It said, "You stood for me before I knew what to ask for. Now I know. I'll take it from here." She didn't respond. She didn't have to, because the mission was never to finish the fight. It was to make sure no one stood alone in it again. The camera turned. Jasmine did not. She walked into history not with force, but with focus, not with spectacle, but with substance. Her legacy? Not a name in lights, but a line in the sand. Not applause, but alignment. A new standard for truth, and a new question for us all. What will you do with what you now know? Because democracy is not a performance, it is participation. Power listens to silence, but it obeys volume. You don't need a robe or a podium. You need to act. Demand hearings, read the bill, share the words, show up, stay loud. Because justice is not a system, it is a decision. And silence? Silence is what injustice feeds on. But your voice is voltage. You don't have to stand in court to stand for justice, but you do have to stand somewhere. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications, share this, and then do more.